Hello and welcome to Macma Literacy for week, who knows? I haven't got a clue. Make sure that you like and subscribe, and also make sure you've got a pen and paper because you're about to learn some vocab about English. Okay, let's dive straight in to word one, and word one is interpretation. Now, the actual definition of interpretation is the act of explaining something. So if you have something that is just sitting there, you've got no opinion on it, nobody's got any opinion of it, and then somebody comes along and explains it to you and adds their own spin on what it means. The easiest way to describe this, I guess, would be to describe data, where you've got a lot of statistics, maybe stuff to do with how many times a team has won the football, and a member of one team might explain this in a completely different way to a member of a different team. So one interpretation might be that the team is doing really, really well, and another interpretation is that they're just kind of coasting and could do better. I don't know about sport. I don't know why I started a sport analogy. So let's see how it relates to English. When we get a text, everybody who reads that text is going to have a slightly different or completely different viewpoint on it. So, for example, when The Tempest came out, the play The Tempest by Shakespeare, the people watching it then would have had a completely different opinion to the people who watch it now. One interpretation of it now is a post-colonial interpretation where we look at it as Prospero being a colonizer of the island that it's set on. Now, Shakespeare is particularly good for looking at different interpretations because he's fairly scarce on stage directions. Stage directions are those bits where they tell you what people look like, what they're wearing, where they should stand. He's fairly to the point, and that means that, say, an interesting monologue can be done in lots of different ways, and it just gives the director a lot of space to create their own interpretation. Now, you may also look at something like A Christmas Carol, and one interpretation, if you've been doing GCSE with me, you'll know, is that it's actually an anti-Semitic analogy of a Jewish person being converted to Christianity. Now, that may well have been in Dickens' head, it probably wasn't, but it's an interpretation of the text, because when it comes to interpretations, it doesn't really matter what the original reader meant or what people used to think of it. The text is free, it is a creature on its own, it's taken flight, and as long as you can back up your interpretation with evidence from the text and from context, then your argument is as good as any. So that's today's word, interpretation. And if you could fill out the Freya model for it, please. So if you can just pop in a definition of interpretation. And if you could write some characteristics of interpretation, so something about interpretations or different types of interpretations. Now, if you could add some examples of interpretations. And finally, some non-examples, because we do tend to think in binary and we remember things well from what they are not. So you've got your interpretation. It's wonderful. You're a big fan of it. You've looked at all different interpretations, but you've got your one that you really, really like, and you decide to put on a play or make a film, create a TV show. You've got this power. You're some kind of rich producer. It's great. You can just do things on a whim like that. So what are you going to do? You are going to make an adaptation, and the word adaptation, you will know from science, means the process of change, or how something changes, usually in reaction to something in the environment. So an adaptation is that you are taking that text, and the change in the environment is you and your interpretation. And you are changing that text into something new, whether that be a film, whether it be a new version of the play. That's your adaptation. Now, adaptations get a pretty bad rep because many of them can be rubbish. So if you turn in a book into a film, people are often like, oh, I like the book better. Now, sometimes they're doing that just to be smug and be like, I read the book and you didn't. But most of the time, it's because if you read the book first, books create such an incredibly vivid, or good books create such an incredibly vivid image in your mind, and those characters become like real people, and then you see somebody else's interpretation. Everybody looks different. They're highlighting different aspects because of course an interpretation isn't just like what people look like, it's to do with what the big messages of the story are and things like that. And all of a sudden those things are slightly different, and they're drawing attention to things that you hadn't thought were that important, and they're ignoring the things that you thought were important. People can have quite a strong reaction to that, and sometimes, you know, they're just done badly. Sometimes they don't draw out any of the interesting themes. Anyway, adaptation is when something is taken from one form, maybe from a book and made into a movie, maybe from a play and made into a movie. You can actually have that kind of like reverse adaptation. Sometimes when a film has been made, they then write a book of it. It's much rarer, but it's a thing that happens. I don't know about the quality of them. I would assume not great, but that might be just my snobbishness. I can't help it. I'm an English teacher. I get snobby about books. I get all like, oh, defensive of them, you know? Like I want to fight you off if you try and change them. Okay. Could you fill out your frame model for adaptation? So you'll want the definition of adaptation, just what the words mean, what the word means rather, there's only one of them. Then if you could mention characteristics, so you might want to talk about, you know, specifically what adaptation is when we're talking about English. And then some examples of adaptations. For example, Baz Luhrmann's famous Romeo and Juliet adaptation set Romeo and Juliet in a much more modern setting, with guns instead of swords, but keeping the original text from the play, mostly. And that's a well-loved adaptation. It's also fine to discuss elements of adaptation in an essay, as long as our main discussion is rooted in the play or the original text itself. Unfortunately, the problem with the Baz Luhrmann version is that students often start discussing guns. There are no guns in Romeo and Juliet. Just swords, daggers, knives, humans, and so on. And finally, some non-examples. So some examples of things that are not adaptation. You can just pop them in there. And then here's what I've put. You can just read through these yourself. And also, of course, if you could add a dual code, hopefully you will have done that for interpretation as well. What would I go for interpretation? Maybe something with glasses to do with seeing things differently, maybe. Adaptation, I'd probably have like a little creature that's been like swimming in the sea and then it's coming out to land, because it's like the sciencey adaptation, but maybe that's just confusing. So maybe, I don't know. Oh, just a book and then an arrow and then a TV set. It's pretty boring, but it's probably more sensible. Quick to draw, whatever. Anyway, now our next word is something that you need to create these interpretations, right? So interpretations require you to look further than the exact words on the page. Interpretations are all about seeing subtext, so information that's bubbling underneath the written word, stuff that's going on there that might not be said in the most obvious way. And we do this all the time when we're talking to people, when we're just generally living our lives. We are doing this, we're figuring things out. And in English, in the subject of English, the word that we use for figuring things out is inference. So we are making an inference. That is the noun version. The abstract noun is an inference. That is me figuring something out. But if, as I'm doing it, the verb version is to infer. Now, you will definitely be familiar with the kind of sister term on the binary. That's imply. So if I'm not wanting to go out for dinner this evening, and the person that I'm meant to be going out for dinner with is talking about dinner, and I'm just like, oh, I'm just really busy tomorrow, and I'm just like not really sure. I'm kind of implying to them that I might not want to go, right? Now, they may completely ignore these implications. They might be like, I don't care, or they're just not listening, whatever. But they may figure out that I actually don't want to go. And that would be them inferring, them making the inference that I don't want to go out for dinner. Inferences are tricky. Sometimes they're correct, sometimes they're not. But regardless, as long as they're based on something, they're an inference. So if you're reading a text and you figure something out, as long as you've got quotes to support it and a decent explanation of why that may be the case, that's where you're going to get marks in an essay, okay? It's all about figuring out stuff that isn't there. So if you're sitting there going, the writer presents Jerry is annoyed, for example, Jerry was annoyed, you can't make an inference there. There's nowhere to go. It literally says Jerry was annoyed. But if you're saying that the writer suggests Jerry's annoyed, and then you describe all of the things that suggest that he's annoyed, it's not a great inference, because why are we talking about Jerry being annoyed? But you see what I mean. You need to be looking deeper, further than just the basic things that are said on the page. You need to be making those inferences. And the bigger the inferences that we can make, like I mentioned before about Scrooge and anti-Semitism, that's because of some of the language that's used throughout A Christmas Carol regarding Scrooge the character, which aligns him with some really just stereotypical views of Jewish people. And the fact that there are 3 ghosts, like the Holy Trinity, and you start to look at those things and you start to come up with one big inference regarding the whole thing. You start to infer that there might be an anti-Semitism there. And so let's dive in to our Freya model for inference. So our definition of inference is to figure something out, or something that we have figured out. So our definition of inference is something that we have figured out. And then our characteristic, well, I guess that would be not simply repeating what the writer has said, but using your mind to figure things out, as was our definition. Examples of figuring things out would be guessing the killer in a murder mystery based on the clues. And a non-example would be just completely guessing wildly. It's not an inference, it's just a guess. Fabulous. And now we are moving on to our spellings. So today I'm going to want you to spell interpretation, adaptation, and inference. So let's start with interpretation. And adaptation. And inference. Excellent. And have a little look at the way that they're actually spelt. Interpretation, adaptation, inference. Mostly this sort of, as you would imagine, I think, interpretation. It's a bit complicated, but you can figure it out if you kind of say it in your mind like that. Inference, as long as you recognise that it's the CE, no S. Adaptation, just remembering those bits. They're all a bit bitty, but they're not overly complex. Let's give it another go. Interpretation. Adaptation. Inference. Fabulous. Give it a check. And for the final time, adaptation, interpretation, and inference. And finally, if we just move on to the definitions, have a little dual code. My suggestion would be a magnifying glass for inference, because you're like a detective. You're a text detective. So if you just fill that out, then that is it for me from this week, which I still don't know which week it is. 21, maybe? Something like that. I think we're over 20. Have a lovely week. You'll see me next week. May I remind you to like and subscribe. My disembodied voice is about to say it afterwards, but also, just it bears repeating. Like and subscribe. I don't know why it bears repeating. It doesn't actually really matter, but I would like it just for my own feelings of worth. Gotta stop talking now. Mwah! Thank you for joining us for another week on Macamol Literacy. If you enjoy starting with a word and then ending up in a rambling journey to who knows where, then I suggest that you hit like and subscribe. Also, if you just want to be a pal, like and subscribe. See you next week.